Okay.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming here tonight as we hear author Wiley Cash discuss his newest book, When Ghosts Come. Today he's joined by fellow author Daniel Wallace. I'm Morella, the social media and events coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming tonight and purchasing a book of either of the authors, as it helps us move forth and bring more events to you guys. To make the event more accessible, we are recording this event and it will be up on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. And we are asking authors to conclude around 7 p.m. to be mindful of our colleagues. And finally, I'd like to introduce our authors for tonight. Wiley Cash is the award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of A Land More Kind Than Home, the acclaimed The Stark Road to Mercy, and most recently, The Last Ballad. He is a winner and finalist of numerous prizes. He's a two-time winner of the Southern Book Prize and a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. He is the founder of the Open Canon Book Club and serves as writer-in-residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, photographer Wiley Cash, and their 2 daughters. We're also joined tonight by Daniel Wallace. He is the J. Ross McDonald Distinguished Professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the creative writing program. He's the author of novels like Big Fish, Rain Reverse, The Watermelon King, Mr. Sebastian the Negro Magician, The Kings and Queens of Rome, and The Extraordinary Adventures. So, thank you again for coming, and please give it up for our authors.
I was impressed by you before I got here, but after hearing that introduction, I'm even more impressed.
You were like, I didn't know who this guy was at all.
I can't believe it. You're so modest. I didn't have any idea.
Well, speaking of modesty, I put on Facebook that I was doing this event at Flyleaf in Chapel Hill, and 2 people wrote me on Facebook, and both of them said, "Does Daniel Wallace have a new book out?" and I said, "No." And this one guy just wrote back, "Dang." And I don't guess he's here.
I guess not. I guess not. Those are those 2 seats.
Exactly. He's like, never mind.
Yeah.
See you later.
Return the ticket to them. Do you remember where we met?
The first time we met was at Crook's Corner at the book prize. I was the first winner. My first novel, Land More Kind Than Home. Thank you, Laura. Won the Crook's Corner book prize. That would have been January of 2014. And you were there, and a bunch of other writers were there, and it was a big night for me. You know, we had moved back to North Carolina just a few months before, in the fall of 2013. I grew up in North Carolina. I went to graduate school in Louisiana. Spent 5 years living in West Virginia, and to come back and win a prize that was, it's a Southern prize, but it's really a North Carolina prize. It feels like to me because of who was giving it. And then to see you and Jill was there and so many other North Carolina writers, it just felt like it was going to be okay. You know?
Yeah, it was like welcome home.
Yeah,
Here's a prize.
It felt, and some wine every day for a year.
Well, so I wanted to ask you about that because that is one of the things that you win when you win this Crook's Corner prize is that you can go into Crook's Corner any night and get a free glass of wine. Now that the restaurant's closed, I'm wondering, did you have any contractual agreement that you could get that wine elsewhere?
I just show up. I have to go through tax records and find out who the final owners were, and then I just show up wherever I can find.
At their house.
Sit in their driveway. Yeah. I show up already drunk and demand the wine, which I find that more responsive.
I'm sure you'll get a prize for that. You'll get a prize for almost everything. So we're going to talk about this book a little bit. When Ghosts Come Home, one of the best titles in my experience. I love this title. When I saw you posted the cover a long while ago, and I just knew it was going to be good. Not disappointed. The last question I want to ask you is to summarize your almost 400-page novel in a tidy little paragraph. but would you do that?
I would love to. So, another word about the Crooks Corner Book Prize, and to show you what a great friend Daniel is. The first year that I won it, I won $1,000, which was a huge deal, and I was super excited to win $1,000. And then the next year, they changed it to $5,000. At the night of the award, when it was announced, Daniel texted me, "Crooks Corner owes you $4,000." This novel takes place in the fall of 1984 when a sheriff named Winston Barnes is awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of a low-flying aircraft that passes over his house. He knows there is no good reason for an aircraft to be flying this low, for an aircraft this large, to be coming in this late to a little municipal airport off the coast of North Carolina, or on the coast of North Carolina in Oak Island. I'm sure many of y'all know where Oak Island is. And so he goes out to the airport in the middle of the night, and what he finds there changes not only his life, but the life of this little community forever. He finds an abandoned DC-3, which is a World War II era aircraft. It's sitting sideways at the end of the runway. The rear landing gear has snapped off. The plane's completely abandoned. It's empty. Later, they'll not be able to recover any fingerprints from the inside of the aircraft. And then in the grass alongside the runway is the body of a local man who's been shot dead and left behind. His name is Rodney Bellamy. He is the son of a local history teacher. The history teacher is also a de facto civil rights leader. And the sheriff knows the family, and you know how the South is. I know this guy's family. He's not involved in this. But that doesn't stop the sheriff's challenger. He's facing a tough re-election. His challenger is the son of a local developer. He's this guy who's been handed the world and mistaken it for brains. And he's running against the sheriff, and he sees an opportunity to introduce wedge issues like race and crime into this election and promise that only he can keep the residents of Oak Island safe, where this aging sheriff is failing. And it may recall, some political lines of the past couple of years, things like "I alone can fix it," and that's certainly what the sheriff's challenger is saying.
Well done.
Thank you. It was more than just a couple of words, but I got to tighten that pitch a little bit in case I get in an elevator with a Hollywood director, which happened to my wife twice. She was in Atlanta right before the pandemic and found herself at a hotel in the elevator twice with Ron Howard. And I was like, the first time I was like, "Did you mention me?" And she's like, "I just didn't have a chance. It was like Ron Howard," and I panicked. And then when I saw him again, I was like, "You saw him again and you still didn't?" Like, "Hey, I know you adapted J.D. Vance's book." And I know, anyway.
And are you thinking also of running for office?
I am also, I'm going to use my very narrow platform to become a eugenicist and run for office like J.D. Vance.
Actually, it's even worse with Mallory not doing that. The elevators, I've noticed in Atlanta, go really high.
Yeah, I know. And she was on the 17th floor and he was on the 18th. And she was like, "I've never looked at my watch for so long and not made eye contact with the famous person who could have changed our lives."
Could have changed our lives. Yeah. Otherwise, what a supportive wife.
It's very supportive. Very. She took my author photo, so that made up for it.
So, as anyone here knows who read any of Wiley's other books, and those who haven't can tell by his introduction to this one, he has such a handle on the depth of character in these books. When he was talking about it, he told you every detail, where the wheels were, what kind, everything about the plane, but he also knows everything about people he writes about in a way that's so impressive to me. Tell me how you know that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that as well, and maybe in some ways, I think that everything that we write is somehow part of us. There was a North Carolina writer, Charles Chestnut, who's raised in Fayetteville, born in 1858, and died in 1932, and he said that writing.
He even knows.
He said writing fiction is the power of rearranging your memory, and I think that's true of me to a certain degree. I was at an event today, and I came up on the spot with this kind of comparison that, there's a lot of emotions in this novel. There's hopelessness, there's pain, there's humor, there's loss, there's fear, there's uncertainty, and we've all felt that way, and we don't have to imagine having felt that way. And I'm sure, working with students at Chapel Hill, oftentimes where I teach at UNC Asheville, students come into my class and they say, I'm really excited about this novel that I'm setting in New York City. And I say, oh, that's great. Were you raised there? No. Have you ever visited? No. Well, that's how you get a book deal, is you write novels set in New York City. And I say, no, you get a book deal by writing novels that feel real and actual. And, where are you from? And I remember a couple of years ago, I had a student from Mount Airy, speaking of Ron Howard. And he said, nothing ever happens in Mount Airy. And I said, have you ever been angry? Well, yeah. You ever had your heart broken? Well, yeah. That happened in Mount Airy. So things happen there. Things happen to you there. And until you can look at yourself and find your own life worthy of literature, good luck creating lives that are worthy of literature. And so I think when I think about my characters, I think about the ways that I need them to feel, and the causality of their emotion may not be the same causality as my emotion of my anger. The sheriff has some anger in this novel. His daughter has some heartbreak in this novel. And my anger and my heartbreak hasn't been caused by the same things, but I can feel those things. And then I just have to reverse engineer how they got there. I've got to, kind of set the dominoes back up. I know they all fell, but I don't know exactly what they were. And so it's like digging a hole and then putting the dirt back in to see what was in all the shovel loads, And that's kind of what the process of writing is for me. And one thing that I find useful is, you come up with a character that feels real and resonant, and that you feel like you can spend a couple of 3 years with when you're doing this. I write under the pseudonym Nicholas Sparks, and I write those books much faster. Those are much faster novels. That's how I sustain this much less successful side hustle of writing the novel we're here to talk about tonight. But you have to have characters that feel a little mysterious to you, that surprise you in ways that you think, oh, I didn't know they would do that. I didn't know they were capable of that, because you're going to spend time with them, And I think a lot of that depth comes from me just sitting with them for as long as I have to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it is remarkable, I think, that you know who they are, and you know what toothpaste they use. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. I mean, you know the shoes they wear.
Yeah.
Where they buy their socks.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean,
yes, well, of course.
Well, don't we all know create social security numbers and bank account information for our characters? This novel set in 1984, and that's historical fiction. We don't want to admit that, but it is. But I would argue that fiction set this morning, when there's been a day-long outage of Facebook and Instagram, if you're going to write about whatever today's date is, the 4th of October, 2021, you're going to have to mention that, right? And all fiction is historical fiction, especially if we're writing realistic fiction, which I try to do. But with a novel set in 1984 that felt like such a particular moment in pop culture, I mean, we've got MTV, we've got television advertising. It was really fun to go back and look at some of the product placements. And I think about a novel like Bobby Ann Mason's novel, In Country, which I love that novel so much. And when her career began, she was dismissed as writing Kmart realism. But people who shop at Kmart were like, thank God, I feel seen, right? And it resonated with me, it resonated with other readers to really see yourself in the items you use on the page, because items is where we can put abstractions, When I have students who want to write about heartbreak, they just write about heartbreak and sadness and tears, and I'm like, you got to give me an object, and then I'll understand, and then we can communicate those things. And so objects to me build character, they build emotion, they build kind of setting and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's remarkable. So I want you to read a little bit out of this now. I had the galley, which I thank you for. But on National Pre-Order Day, you invented.
I did invent that. Yep.
National Pre-Order Day, I pre-ordered one, and I was thinking, I'm going to get the hardback. Can't wait to get the hardback. They sent me the large print edition, and I was wondering if there was some.
You've been flagged in the system.
Flagged, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is large. I don't even know if the pagination is the same, but do you think you can find something?
I can find, yeah. I usually read the first 50 pages anyway, which in this book is the first 70. And then we'll take a break. I'll use the restroom. We'll play the audiobook over the PA while I refresh myself. Let me think for a moment. I'll read, I'm sorry, let me see. I'll read this scene where the mother and so there's another character in this novel. The sheriff has a daughter named Colleen. She's 25 years old, and she is fleeing a marriage on the rocks, a new marriage on the rocks. She is home from Texas, nursing this heartbreak that she can't quite even verbalize, and she finds herself back in her childhood bedroom. And she went to law school at Carolina, and she got pregnant during her final semester. And she and her boyfriend at the time, who was also a law student, reached an agreement. They'll both graduate. He'll take the bar exam, and then she'll have the baby, and then she'll take the bar exam the following year. And then she loses the baby. It's a stillborn child, and she realizes that she was supposed to be a lawyer, and now she's not. And then she was supposed to be a mother, and now she's not that either. And so when she goes home, she's trying to make sense of her life. And she realizes that, while home makes sense to her, her relationship with her parents might not be making as much sense to her. And one of the really fun things was creating her childhood bedroom. And I'm glad that Jill McCorkle is here tonight, because I put out a thing on Facebook and asked, what did your childhood bedroom was like? And Jill was one of the people that answered. And so some of the things that were in Jill's childhood bedroom are in this woman's bedroom from the late 70s and early 80s. So David Cassidy, beanbag chair, an olive green rotary phone, all the necessities. But this is a scene where after Colleen, her first night at home, she stays up a little bit too late. She sneaks downstairs, drinks some of her dad's beers, and she wakes up in the morning to her mother knocking on her door, just like she's a teenager, and trying to stir her out of bed. And her mother tells her, we've got to go to the grocery store. The FBI is bringing in an FBI agent who's a pilot. He's going to try to fly this plane up to Wilmington to get it off the runway so they can process it. And he's going to stay with us because there's no hotels in the off-season in Oak Island. And we've got to go to the grocery store. And we don't ever get to spend time together, and I want you to go with me. And so on the way to the grocery store, the mother is telling this story about a friend of hers whose kids visit all the time. And Colleen's driving, hungover, and she's listening to how great this woman's kids are, and they live in Raleigh. And she understands what's happening. This is a guilt trip, and they get into an argument. Mom, I live in Texas. I can't come home whenever I want to. Well, this isn't about you, Colleen. Then what's it about, Mom? Well, I don't know. Not everything's about you, Colleen. And she knows very well that it's about her. And so I want to read just an excerpt of them going to the grocery store. So if y'all indulge me just for a little bit, this was a scene that I enjoyed writing. When she reached the end of the aisle and turned left to round another, she spotted a woman at the far end pushing a young baby in a stroller. Colleen recognized her immediately. It was Myra Page, a girl she'd been friends with in high school but had hardly seen since they both left home for college. Myra didn't see her, and Colleen stood for a moment, watching the baby in the stroller, who looked to be a little boy. He was chewing on something as if his teeth hurt, and Colleen thought of the Brazelton book. She's been carrying this Brazelton book like a Dr. Spock book, and tried to gauge his age, but something in her stomach turned, and she suddenly feared that she was going to vomit right there on the floor. She spun away from Myra toward the meat counter, where great slabs of steaks and ground hamburgers sat on crushed ice behind thick glass. She tried to remember the layout of the store, to recall where the restrooms were. She scanned the back wall for a sign, and then she saw it on her left and made a beeline for it. Colleen was barely able to close the stall door and lift the lid of the toilet. She gets sick. I'll spare you the details. You can read them in your own time. She opened the stall door and walked to the sink. She ran the water and splashed it over her face, cupped some of it into her mouth, swished and spit it out. Her pale face stared at her from the mirror. She winced at the dark circles under her eyes. Her blonde hair still looked damp where she'd pulled it back in the stubby ponytail. Her pocketbook was in her mother's shopping cart, so she didn't have anything with her. No lip gloss, no brush, nothing to improve what she was seeing before her. She pinched her cheeks to bring color back into them, gave them a few light slaps. She opened her mouth, smiled gruesomely at herself. Outside the bathroom, Colleen saw that Myra Page had reached the end of the aisle and was now standing by the butcher's counter, a woman beside her. To her great horror, Colleen discovered that the woman with Myra was her own mother, and she was holding Myra's baby in her arms, her fingers clasping the teething toy and passing it in and out of the baby's mouth while its flailing arms reached for it. Myra and her mother were laughing. Both women looked up and saw Colleen at the same time. Her mother smiled a smile that looked like elation to Colleen. Myra simply waved as if she and Colleen were still girlfriends. Myra, as if remembering or intuiting the great upheaval of Colleen's life, cocked her head to the side and looked at Colleen as if she were a child. "And how are you?" she asked once Colleen was close enough. "You're in..." She paused as if trying to remember something. "Texas now, right?" "Yeah," Colleen said. "Dallas. My husband took a job there." "Wow," Myra said. "I bet it's really beautiful out there." "It's nice," Colleen said. She tried to smile, tried to keep her eyes off of Myra's baby boy. "It's growing on me." "Well, now she's home visiting her mama," Colleen's mother said, rocking her body and the baby from side to side at the word mama. She laughed a little and looked at Colleen. Her face changed. "Are you okay?" she asked. Colleen nodded and did her best to smile. "Honey, did you just throw up?" And then they get into another fight in the car.
Yeah, that's a lovely passage. I remember that vividly. And it is a great example of this realism that you do like nobody else, I think, that this we can see so intimately this scene and exactly where they are, who they are, the awkwardness of that moment. It's also one of the many plot lines that run through this thing. This is not just a stream. These are tributaries all filling into this river. The complexity of it is astounding, and yet it's completely readable, completely understandable, and it's I think maybe the complexity is clear to me as a writer trying to think of doing this. So I don't even know if I've got a question here, but how do you do that? How do you bring all of these tributaries into the river? And I'll have a follow up on this.
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I've got really three main characters. I've got the sheriff, and he's got point of view chapters. I've got his daughter Colleen, who I read from. She's got point of view chapters. And there's a third character, a young black boy, a teenage boy, 14 years old from Atlanta, and he is the brother-in-law of the man who's found dead on the runway. And his name's Jay. He's been set up from Atlanta by his parents. He got into some trouble in Atlanta, and they've sent him out to the country to live with his older and perfect sister and her perfect husband and their perfect young baby. And Jay is caught up in this racial tension and has to make some tough decisions and some bad decisions, really based on his anger and his frustration and his curiosity. But I think that, when I'm writing, I'm trying to think about all of the emotions I want to hit in a novel. And this is 1984. It's a watershed moment in American history. We have Ronald Reagan gliding into the White House with 60% of the popular vote. He won 49 states except for Mondale's Minnesota. And it's morning in America. We are a city on a hill amidst the AIDS crisis, amidst the crack epidemic, amidst all these issues that are going on in America, the bottoming out of Rust Belt America. But there was just this glaze kind of over it all. And there was so much rage and so much uncertainty and so much fear beneath the facade of really how I was raised. I mean, I was 7, 8 years old in 1984, and that was my first sentient political season. And I'm from Gastonia, where the Mount Rushmore of Gastonia is Jesse Helms, Ronald Reagan, Richard Petty, and Dean Smith, right? And I think only 2 of those still belong there. And so I was raised never questioning that identity. And then as an adult, you look back and you look at that moment and you see the turmoil of that national moment. And so I knew that I wanted to have the character speak to the frustration that many women felt coming out of the 1960s and 1970s and the what we now called then the women's liberation movement, and saying I thought my life was going to be different, and then I succumbed to these same forces that my mother did. And I'm back home with my mom, and I judge my mom for never being bold enough to step outside the box of domesticity. And I did, and here I am. And maybe I'm worse than I always thought my mom was. And so I wanted Colleen to really fester in that discomfort, right? And I knew that would generate a lot of energy, that dissatisfaction. And I wanted Jay, this young kid from Atlanta, to tap into this racial moment that he doesn't understand the legacy of the race massacre of 1898 in Wilmington or school desegregation. But those forces are going to come to bear on his life in the same way that the glaze of Jesse Helms came to bear on mine. And I didn't know that. I didn't understand that some of the conversations that happened at my dinner table about affirmative action were being affected by Jesse Helms' 1988 campaign ads about your job was given to a minority to meet a quota. I didn't know that then, but I still sat through those conversations nonetheless. And I wanted these emotional moments to coincide with these political moments where characters are really having to wade through them. And the sheriff's a little bit older, and he's hip to what's going on. I think he fancies himself a more thoughtful progressive, as much as he could self-actualize that in 1984. But he still struggles to really know what the right thing to do is amidst all of this. And that's how I wanted all these characters to feel in the novel.
Yeah. Well, the title, When Ghosts Come Home, that implies so many different things. And part of it is the flaws that we all have.
Mm-hmm.
We enact our lives on the basis of who we are, which is, by definition, flawed.
Sure.
And those are some of the ghosts, but there's so many other ghosts. To add to what you were saying, or to ask another question based on that, as you said earlier, every story is a historical
mm-hmm.
story, and in a way, every story is also a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
But this, in fact, is a mystery.
Yeah.
So the construction of that would seem to ask for more, perhaps, planning, more focus on where this plot is going, as opposed to just letting your characters work it all out.
Yeah.
So how is writing this book different from writing your other three?
It was unfortunately very similar. And I didn't really know I was writing a traditional mystery literally until the last maybe third of the book was being written, and I was sharing it with my editor. And I created these characters, and I didn't really know what was going to happen to them. And I had pages and pages of characters and these scenes that felt real and evocative, and I was hitting all these emotional points. There's a scene with the sheriff and his secretary where she kind of reveals these surprising racial cultural attitudes that he didn't see coming, and I knew I was writing to that moment. There's some tender scenes between the sheriff and his daughter from her childhood. I knew I was writing toward those moments. There's some scenes where Jay meets this white kid near his neighborhood and they play basketball. I knew I was writing toward those moments. And then I had all these moments and I was so satisfied by them. And my editor said, well, what happens at the end? And I said, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. And so we tried all these endings and none of them were right. And it was to the point where I would send him an ending and then regret it and text him and say, don't read that, because you can't unsee it once you've seen it. And that happened several times. And he was like, look, what are you doing? I was like, I don't know. I was flailing at the end. And then one day, these strange things began to reveal themselves to me as opportunities throughout the text to have a real mystery. My first two novels, have been called mysteries, but those are mysteries in that the characters don't have all the information, and the reader has all the information. And the mystery is, when are the characters going to have the information the reader has, and what's going to happen? Is it going to be violent? Is it going to be peter out? What's going to happen? With this novel, the characters and the reader don't have all the information. And there's a couple of big reveals. There's some twists at the end that made me feel, this sounds self-indulgent, but I felt really smart when I did it by accident. I was like, this is what it feels like to be a cerebral writer, you know, to like be able to pull the tablecloth while all the stuff stays on the table and make the reader ask, like, how did they do that, you know? And I don't have an answer for that. It was literally in many ways blind luck that it ended up being a more traditional mystery. And I don't know that I could do it again. But I was really satisfied that it worked out that way this time, because, you know, when you have characters you believe in, they weigh a lot on the page, and you want your plot to be fleet-footed and fast and well-paced. And with heavy characters, sometimes it's hard to do that. And so hopefully I did that here. We'll see.
Well, is it Robert Frost who said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader?
I'll buy that. That sounds good. Yeah. Well, I mean, and it did feel that way to me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I hope people are as surprised by this ending as I was.
Yeah. They definitely will be. It's really remarkable how it all comes together. So lots of writers, such as myself, you know, that write a book and hopefully get it published, and but your oeuvre, if that's how you pronounce that word.
Nobody really knows.
Nobody really knows how that is. There seems to be a connectivity to them. There seems to, you can see them on a shelf. You can see this world, and I want you to talk about that, because I don't have that. You know, I don't. They're disparate, but yours seem like telling one big story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that. I write about North Carolina because it's the place that I know the best. I'm from here. I pretty much grew up here. My children were born here. My wife was raised here. I went to school here, a lot of school here. And I'm endlessly fascinated by the state, politically, culturally, regionally, historically, because it's a state where there is so much great tension. You know, every 4 years, we don't know quite if we're going to be blue or red. We have regional tension between these three very discernible, identifiable regions. We have cultural tension over foodways. We have sports tension over basketball, you know, especially in a region like this. And then, of course, we have the historical tension of being a relatively moderate state during civil rights under governors like Terry Sanford, and then we swing far right under a governor like Pat McCrory, you know. And so we don't know quite what we are. And as a writer, that's such a wonderful place to draw from. Mississippi is another place it's great to be from if you're a writer, but in Mississippi, it's Mississippi against the world. It's like, Mississippi, you know. We got Faulkner and Lenore Welty, and we've got, you know, all these other people, Richard Wright, and, you know. But in North Carolina, it's North Carolina against North Carolina, and that feels, that kind of infighting and that constant shifting and changing is so interesting to me. And so whenever I write a book, I'm thinking about what is North Carolina in this era that I'm writing about in 1984. It's Jesse Helms and Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And what is North Carolina in 1929 when I wrote this labor novel about a mill strike? Well, it's workers' rights, it's gender issues, it's capitalism, it's organizing. And so I'm always thinking about what is North Carolina in this moment that I'm writing, and I don't think I'll ever tire of being in conversation with the state in that way. So to hear you say that I've kind of got a cohesiveness to them, that means a lot, because that's something that I strive to do. I try to never write the same novel twice, but I know that I'm always, at least in my mind, going to write North Carolina novels.
So don't talk about this, but ask you a question, not to say it. Don't answer it. You're working on something new now. Do you feel like, can you see already and how this talks to the other books?
Yeah. I could tell you a little bit. I'm working on, especially given where I am. I haven't talked about this. It's follow up to The Notebook. It's a novel set in 2018, and it covers a handful of days after Silent Sam is toppled here on campus. And it's set in the eastern part of the state, in the Cape Fear region, because we've been living there, and I feel like if I'm going to know that region as well as I know the western part of the state, now that we've lived there and have children from there, I've got to write about it and really kind of try to get to the bottom of it.
That's remarkable. I could continue to ask you questions, but I feel like this audience has some that they would like to ask. So I want to open it up to you guys and pepper him with questions. Get him off guard. Make him laugh out.
Questions are the best part. If y'all have questions, I'd love it if anybody asks. Yes, sir. Bill.
So have you, in your other books, have you gone down the path not knowing what was at the end? And then the second question would be, if you can tell this without having a spoiler, were there one or two sort of interesting possible ends to this one that you rejected along the way?
Yeah, there were a couple of interesting ends. I don't want to say just now, because I can't give the ones that didn't happen without spoiling the one that does, but I knew that the emotional tone the novel ends on, I knew I wanted to end there. I just knew I wanted to end there. The closing image, I knew that was the closing image. I didn't know how I was going to get there. I didn't know what the fallout of me getting there would be in terms of these characters' lives, but I knew what I wanted that tone to be. It was like throwing a dart at a dartboard. I knew what the target was, and the book was me practicing my throwing and trying to hit it. And that's what a lot of those endings were, me trying to get to that ending. The other novels that I've written, they've all been a little bit different. You know, my first novel, A Land More Kind Than Home, was a very tight novel. It was more similar to this one. It took place over just a handful of days. The through line does, but it jumps around in time and decades and things. But the narrative through line is just a couple of days. And I didn't know exactly how that novel would end, but I also wrote that novel essentially without having an agent or an editor, and I wrote it in the early morning hours before teaching and the late night hours after grading, composition essays. And so that novel, when I think of that novel, I think of this like delicious privacy of nobody having any expectations that I would ever finish it or have anything to show for it. And so that was a really organic experience working my way. That was the first novel I'd ever tried to write. So really working my way through how do novels work? How do I build the scaffolding to make one scene move to the next, And then my second novel, I kind of knew how that one would end, but then it went on past where I thought the ending would be in a way that felt satisfying to me. And then my third novel was based on a true story, and I knew how that story ended. I knew how those events ended, but events are not a story. And so I knew the events of the Lorry strike in 1929. I knew the day the strike began. I knew the day people were murdered. I knew the day of the raids. I knew that stuff. But that's not a story. And so the hard thing about that novel was really finding what is the story of these events, and how do I look at these events in a way that they can gather some narrative energy to propel the reader to want to read forward in terms of discovering what happens to these people. As Daniel said, all books are a mystery to some degree or another. And this wasn't, but I wanted there to be a little mystery to keep you moving forward. And so they've all come with a particular set of challenges, and I think it's good to do that, but it also, it never gets easier for me writing a book. Beginning a book, finishing a book, writing a book, it's never gotten any easier. The easiest book I've written was my first. And it's never, there's no shorthand or anything to kind of visualizing the through line of beginning to end. And I don't know that if I would be as intrigued by it if it were that, Writers I know who crank out a book a year, or maybe 2 books a year, as John Grisham has done lately, that's just the kind of person he is. He likes sitting down and just cranking that out and putting one foot in front of the other And I just don't think that I'm geared that way. You know, I think that I need a little more mystery, a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of kind of a target in the distance, but the ground between is kind of blurry, and I got to move a little bit at a time. Other questions? That was a long answer. People are like, I'm not going to ask one.
You answered 5 questions.
If he's going to talk that long, I'm like, yeah.
You mentioned audiobooks earlier, joking, but when you're writing a book, does the audiobook play in your process at all, or do you write a book and the audiobook happens?
This time it did a little bit, I'll be honest with you, Ian. I chose the audiobook narrator for this one. I did that for Last Ballad as well, but I really went after this guy named J.D. Jackson. He narrated, I heard him because he narrated a book by a writer named Attica Locke. He did her book, Heaven, My Home, and I was just breathless with his narration. I mean, he would move through 5 characters in a scene, having dialogue of like different ethnicities, races, genders. It was a breathtaking experience listening to him. And so I targeted him specifically, but even before then, I was reading a lot of this book out loud. Because I wanted this to be a rhythmic book. I wanted it to be a lean book, a narrow book, a very direct book. But I also wanted it to have a musicality. I didn't want it to be a book that you can read at breakneck pace without paying attention to the language of it and the rhythm of it. And so I did read a lot of this book out loud. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about the audiobook, but I was thinking about how maybe the reader hearing their own voice in their head as their eyes are going over the page. But when I got to the end, I was absolutely thinking about who I wanted to read the audiobook. Because audiobooks are such a part of the market now, with opportunities like Libro FM, which I encourage you all to join. If you listen to Audible or something like that, you can get the same service, same books, but benefit independent bookstores like Flyleaf. So I was definitely thinking about the audiobook at some point, but also thinking about the auditory qualities of it from the very beginning.
Will you ever read one yourself? Do you have any interest in that?
I've put my hat in the ring. I did that for the first one. And they handled, my editor is very diplomatic. He's from Raleigh, so bless his heart. We're on the same wavelength and a lot of stuff. He's way nicer to me than he should be. And I said, I'd like to put my hat in the ring to read one of the characters from Land More Kind Than Home. He's like, great, fantastic. That is, you are so generous with us. That is, it makes you like feel good. He's like, well, let's think about it. Normally they hire trained actors, trained voice actors, and it takes a long time, and you're so busy. But let's think about it. You're completely unqualified, but let's think about, And so I've never gone back to it, but I did think about, since this is a third person, not a first person novel, I did think about really forcing the issue and trying to do this one. But after hearing a pro do it, I think, what in the world was I thinking? Like, this guy's great. I mean, to be able to hold all those characters' voices and attitudes in your mind is pretty breathtaking. So, yeah. Maybe if I write a nonfiction book, the Notebook, behind the scenes, I'll narrate that one.
I tried out for my first book to read it, and this might date me, but I sent them a cassette tape of me reading, and
with a playlist.
Chapter 2.
Yeah. I'm just envisioning you sending an audio cassette that has been recorded over a bunch of time that has music kind of ghostly under it. Yeah. I think somebody else was going to raise their hand. I wouldn't discourage anybody from asking questions. Anybody else? Or about my other books as well? Yeah.
This is sort of like
Dad, I didn't get your name. I met Claire, but I didn't get your name.
So I actually found your work by somebody sending me to the Open Canon Book Club.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, what's the future for the Open Canon Book Club?
That's a great question.
It's a great way to find. I just found it such a rich way to find a diverse set of authors.
Thank you. Yeah.
See that community together.
Yeah, I started that. My wife calls that one more thing I did for free. She says, you do a lot of things for free, but you still don't make that much money doing anything that you get paid to do. That was a book club that I started in the summer of 2018. because I was doing a lot of book clubs with my first 2 books, and I would go to do these book clubs, many of which were drinking clubs with reading problems, and the book clubs would inevitably, at the end, say, do you have any recommendations? We've read your books, we've read all of Daniel Wallace's books, we've read all of Ron Rash's books, and Charles Frazier's books, and Tom Franklin's books, and David Joy's books, and Clyde Edgerton's books. And it dawned on me, well, it just became apparent to me, it didn't dawn on me as so much as I just was aware of it, that they were reading books by people who reminded them of their sons and their husbands. And or who looked like their sons and their husbands. And I thought, what if I started my own book club and I suggested, and to be honest with you, I was thinking about my mom. My mom only reads books by white authors, really, unless I give her something that's not by a white author. And I thought, what if I could get my mom to read diverse books? Not for the sake of the authors, because these authors don't need my help. I'm not trying to get them new readers. I'm trying to get my mom to read new authors. That was the only goal of that book club. And so I started it and launched it just kind of on social media, and we had thousands of people sign up for it. And I was shocked, and then I thought, well, I guess we're doing this now. And the first book we chose was Birds of Opulence by a writer named Krista Wilkinson, a black writer from Kentucky, from Appalachia. And it just went bananas. The book club just went bananas. We were having Facebook takeovers. We were doing recipes from the books. We were doing all this stuff, and it was fantastic. And I was having to constantly shift platforms because the numbers were getting to, I could no longer use MailChimp because it was cost prohibitive. I had to do this other thing, and that became cost prohibitive. And then I was having kind people donate money. I wasn't asking the members for money. But then when the coronavirus hit, I repurposed it and called it Corona Canon. And I was every day hosting writers who had new books out. And so they would come on and they would do a video, maybe a Facebook Live, or they'd send me a video and I would post it about their book, and they would do their book talk as if they were in a bookstore. And I kept that going for maybe 3 weeks, every day doing that. And it just became a lot. And with the pandemic kind of settling in, and then me trying to get this book out, I paused Open Canon, and it hurt to do it because it was so much fun and I was getting so much. We had bookstores around the country giving discounts to people who would call in and say, I'm a member of the Open Canon Book Club, and they'd get whatever the discount was for the bookstore. And it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot at the same time. And with all my other responsibilities, I paused it. But it's still on my website. You can go see all the previous entries and all the previous things some of the things that we did. And maybe I'll start it back up. I've heard from bookstores like the King's English Bookshop in Salt Lake City emailed me a couple days ago. They're like, when's Open Canon coming back? I'm like, wow, I didn't even know you knew about it. So hopefully soon. But it was a lot of fun while it was going. And I became friends with so many authors that I wouldn't have otherwise met. And my mom read so many books that she would never have read. Some of them were a little bit too racy for her, but I see it as a success by that simple fact of my mom. I had to start a book club to get her to do it, but it worked. Maybe one more if anybody has.
I have one quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you're writing a book that takes place almost 40 years ago in the midst of...
That's daunting. That came like a brick.
Sorry, no, it takes place that, it's so long ago, but in the midst of some of the most remarkable things that are happening in the world and our society, culturally, and all of those things. Do things like George Floyd factor into your writing, or are you, as you're writing, just getting away from all that?
I think it definitely factors in. I think we are all, as artists, that sounds so self-indulgent to say this, if we're being honest with ourselves, all of us really, you see something on Facebook and then your kids come home from school and you're short with them. It's not because your kids did something, it's because you saw something on Facebook. And so that same thing happens when you sit down to write. It just whether it's the news or the neighborhood Facebook page. It just comes out in different ways. And so when I was writing When Ghosts Come Home, I was thinking about that moment in 1984 that I was talking about, where so many things in my narrow experience were just implied. Where I was from, if you were a white middle-class family, then you were Republican. And if you were Republican, you were conservative. And if you were conservative, you were Christian. If you were Christian, you were Baptist. And that was, those were just the identities that I inherited and never questioned. And it was just implied that you just navigated the space of my childhood with that implication. And now our political, cultural attitudes are so much more explicit. You know, do you believe in vaccines? Do you wear a mask? Do you make a stink if you have to? Do you wear a red hat? Do you have a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard? That we don't even have those conversations now, because we're like, excuse me, and they turn around and you're like, oh, never mind. Yeah, never mind. I know who you are already because of what you're wearing or not wearing, right? And so I wanted to write a book where those two moments feel as if they're in conversation with one another, because there are moments in the novel where the sheriff has somebody's heart revealed to him in a way that surprises him. Or the sheriff thinks that firing a racist deputy fixes structural racism, right? That just doing these small acts are like, oh, well, that's easy. It's like, years ago, my wife and I went to a friend's wedding down in South Carolina that was on a plantation, and we were kind of surprised that this couple, who we knew them to be, were getting married on a plantation. And we got there a little bit earlier and we're wandering around, and they had these old slave cabins that they had renovated, and they called them like workers' quarters or something. And we went in, and there was a TV on the wall, and my wife like pushed the button, and this TV came alive, and it was like, from the earliest days of colonial America, Africans were brought to our shores. And it was this 10-minute condensed version of like Black History in America that ended with Obama being inaugurated, like waving to a sea of people. And the TV went off, and my wife goes, well, racism's over, everybody, And the sheriff in the novel thinks that he's capable of doing that, right? Without ever having to have those tough conversations, because they're, And so I was thinking about things like that. And this kid from Atlanta that I mentioned, this 14-year-old, has this anger in him that he can't point to it. He can't verbalize why he has it, right? He can't verbalize why he wants to go vandalize the construction site, but he does, right? And all of those cultural moments were kind of the fulcrum on which I kind of set this book, and it was heat enough that kept me coming back to the page. Thank you for that question.
Well, let's end that here.
Yeah, well, thank y'all. Wonderful. Y'all been a great audience. Thank you so much, and thank you, Daniel, for doing this as well. Just showing a less. You guys realize that. Had that much going.